Hello, my name is Barry Kavanagh from Tokyo University in Japan, and today I will be talking about note-taking practices and test scores in academic lectures. So, note-taking, as we all know, is a process of taking notes, perhaps whilst listening to academic content or reading a book of some sort, and you're taking notes so that you can remember what you are learning. And nearly 100 years ago, Crawford examined the relationship between test scores and student ability to write down good notes. And Van der Meer suggests that note-taking in lectures is often taken to be the distinguishing characteristic of learning at university. But academic lectures are difficult. We have new and unfamiliar content, different rates of speech, and perhaps unknown cultural references. And note-taking it's also been seen to improve a student's retention of grammar or vocabulary items and enhance learning. And there are many decision-making processes that a student has to make when they are taking notes. For example, do they write verbatim? Do they paraphrase? Do they use symbols, abbreviations? And also, what language do they use? Do they use their L1, their L2, or even perhaps their L3? So this research has been underrepresented in research literature, and this is what I wanted to look at. So when we talk about what language students use in note-taking, we can talk about translanguaging. And this is the ability of multilingual speakers to shuttle between languages. So people may shuttle between languages for a number of reasons, including who they are addressing and their interactive goals. And translanguaging is the use of a person's multilingual resource. Translanguaging is often used in reference to the skills of speaking and not particularly with writing or academic writing. And research on translanguaging to date seems to be done mostly in non-EFL contexts, typically done in CLIL classes or EMI classes. So this is a research gap I wanted to look at. So translanguaging can and should be broadened to include note-taking. So translanguaging includes not only oral texts, but the use of different languages in written texts as well. Wang, in 2021, found that English language students taking notes in English only did better than students using Chinese only in fact-based questions in the comprehension tests. And Sigel looked at the student note-taking habits in an international survey of English for academic purpose students and found that most students wanted to take their notes in the L2. And he offers a variety of reasons for this. So what I wanted to look at are the following questions. What linguistic choices do students make when taking notes while listening to academic lectures in an EFL context? What abbreviations or symbols do they use when they make notes, if any? More importantly, what language do they use when they are taking notes? Do they use, in my case, Japanese or the language which they're learning, English? And do students who take notes in their L1 or L2 or both the L1 and L2 get better test scores? So the course is an academic listening and speaking course taught at Japanese National University. And the course consists of a unit on note-taking whilst listening. So students learn how to organize information, write quickly, select key points, use abbreviations and symbols, and write in phrases and not in full sentences. And here is a typical example of a worksheet that we use. So we have the abbreviations and symbols and the meaning, and they have to write down what they think these symbols mean. Of course, note-taking is very personal. So what I do in my notes may be different to what another teacher does in their notes. So it can be a very personal endeavour, I think. So the students involved in this study are first-year students at the Japanese University enrolled in 3 different classes. So there was a total of 116 students, and their departments varied. In terms of their proficiency level, it ranged from the CEFR A2 to B2, as indicated by their TOEFL ITP scores, which is a test which they take halfway through the semester. So the methodology used. First, students were given a general survey to find out about their note-taking habits. The questions asked were, how often do you take notes in the classes? How often do you take notes in your English classes? And if you were listening to an English lecture, in which language or languages do you prefer to take notes in, English or Japanese? And please explain the reasons for your choices. So that was an initial general survey given before students listened to the academic lectures. Then students listened to 8 lectures on a different academic topic over a 4-class period. So they listened to 2 lectures per class. Words per minute were around from 140 to 160 words per minute, which is around the same speed as like TOEFL listening or other major external exams. The lecture length ranged from about 2 to 3 minutes. So first, the lecture was played once, and students were allowed to take notes, or encouraged to take notes. But no questions were given at this point. Students were then shown 10 multiple choice questions to look at, and they were given a minute or so just to read through them, and then the lecture was played for a second time. Students could take further notes and answer the questions at the end of the lecture. The students were given about 5-6 minutes to complete these 10 multiple choice questions. After completing those questions, they were given an additional survey to do, which was done after every single academic lecture which they listened to. And the questions were: did you take notes during today's 2 listening activities? Did you take notes using symbols as learned in the worksheets we have done so far? Did you take notes using abbreviations as shown in the worksheets that we've done? Please explain which ones you used. What language did you take notes in today? And they were given the option of Japanese, English, or both. And 5, did you create your own way of note-taking? For example, your own symbols or abbreviations? If so, please write them down here. And then I asked students to upload a photo of their notes into the Google Form. So all of this was done in Google Forms. So the general survey results. How often do you take notes in your classes, lectures? So this is just general classes, not English education. So as you can see, there isn't really much of a custom for taking notes. Yeah, so always only at 11%, often 44%, which is not too bad. But when you look at taking notes in English, it drops considerably. So it always goes to 2%, often 17%. So it's just the biggest percentage here is 47%. Sometimes they sometimes take notes. So there isn't much of a custom for first year Japanese university students to take notes. So which language do students prefer to take notes in? So I asked this question to students, and overwhelmingly 70% said that if they're listening to an English lecture, they prefer to take notes in English. So what are the reasons for this? So here is a sample of some of the ideas which the students gave me. They want to avoid translation, and it speeds things up. So for example, the ability to write down what's heard without the need for translation. Difficulty in deciding which characters, hiragana or kanji, to use when taking notes in Japanese. Faster note taking in English compared to Japanese. Avoidance of the need to translate English into Japanese, so they save time. Preference for writing English due to difficulty in translating words. So here we have lots about translation and speed. Also, they want to take notes in the language of the lecture. So they want to fit the language of the lecture to their notes. And they also want to improve note-taking skills, of course, in English. So there's an inability to keep up with the lecture if translated into Japanese. There's a desire to practice thinking in English rather than translating during lectures. Faster, more accurate note-taking in English if the language is also in English, the language of the lecture. And a desire to improve English skills by practicing note-taking directly in English. There were some reasons for Japanese. So 30% said they prefer to take notes in Japanese. Faster writing speed in Japanese, they can write things quicker, which is interesting. Easy to understand content when reviewing notes in Japanese. Difficulty in writing English fluently. Japanese is easy to review for better understanding post-lecture. And faster note-taking due to familiarity with Japanese. So here we have the idea of speed as well, and clarity and familiarity with the L1. So actual student note-taking practice. What language did they actually use? So after the each academic lecture, when they listened to the lectures, I asked them, did you take notes while listening to these lectures? And majority overwhelmingly did, which was fantastic. Did you take notes using symbols as shown in the worksheets that we have done? So the majority of students did not really use symbols, or if they did, they were just very basic ones. For example, arrow, circle, X, equals, plus, that kind of thing. Some students use abbreviations, so second, sec, high, H, people, PPL, e.g. for example, BC for because. So these were actually in the worksheet, and I did explain these abbreviations to the students. So I didn't really use any kind of original ones here. So here, did you use any original symbols and abbreviations? No, I just wrote down whatever I wanted to. I separated the note to understand the information clearly. So this is students' own words. I wrote the first few letters of each word, which might be confusing when they look at the notes again. Some students said like mil, meaning million, spa, meaning Spain. So I think the note-taking process is very personal. As long as you understand your notes and you understand what you wrote, then it's perfectly fine to abbreviate in any which way you feel comfortable with. Use of Japanese. This is especially evident in difficult to spell words. So many students said they used Japanese or specifically katakana, Japanese syllabary for foreign words, when writing words which they couldn't spell, or they just listened to them and wrote down the katakana equivalent. So this is faster for students to write rather than pondering on the English spelling of the word. So there were many cases of students using Japanese in that situation. So here are some examples of student work, because I asked them to upload some of their notes to the Google form. So very difficult to see, I know, but if you're familiar with Japanese, you can see some words here written in hiragana. So most of these notes here are written in English, and then occasionally you have some Japanese interspersed. So obviously the student didn't know how to spell the words, they just quickly wrote it in katakana. Here is another example, again very difficult to see, but you can see Japanese, mainly in katakana, in fact all in katakana here, interspersed amongst all the English words. There were some samples of students working Japanese. I typed out what they said rather than show you some samples of their work, because it's quite difficult to read. But these, I haven't given any translations, but these are basically technical words or things, mainly nouns. Like for example, we have Spanish second language acquisition. There are some examples of DNA, what they heard in lecture about DNA. So mainly it was nouns rather than verbs. So concepts. They were listening for the content, so they wrote down some concepts in Japanese. This is not katakana. So in English, this student predominantly, she wrote completely in English. She tried to paraphrase what she heard. So just basically broken sentences, note form basically. She tried to write down some basic keywords and some symbols. So, note-taking language in practice. So what language do you take your notes in today? Japanese, English, or both? So combining all of the 8 lectures together, majority of students, fractionally, they used both Japanese and English. So 48% of students used both Japanese and English in the note-taking. This is followed by 43% in English and only Japanese 9%. So they were very much in the minority. So basically students really wanted just to use English, but the majority of them, even though it's just slightly higher, use both Japanese and English. And as I showed in the examples, this is mainly katakana words or nouns about concepts and ideas. Usually words which they may not have heard before or maybe don't know the English equivalent for. So correlating the note-taking language and test scores. So a comparison of the three groupings based on the language used for a one-way ANOVA showed that there was no statistically significant difference in the test scores between students that took notes in English, took notes in Japanese, or both Japanese and English. Yeah. So basically, students who took notes in both English and Japanese got fractionally higher scores, better test scores, than those who just took notes in English or Japanese. So Japanese was the worst, but only slightly, and not many students took notes in Japanese anyway, as I showed you the results before. Majority of students took notes in both English and Japanese, or in English. So there were no differences. So regardless whether or not you took notes solely in English or both Japanese and English, there was no difference in test scores. So let's look at the research questions again. So what linguistic choices do students make when taking notes or listening to academic lectures in an EFL context? So they try to use English in their notes as much as possible to match the language to the lecture. They try to avoid translation, although this could perhaps be cognitively challenging. Speed, yeah, they need to listen and write down as quickly as possible, and they want to improve their English note-taking skills. What abbreviations and symbols do they use? Mainly basic symbols, and there was not much evidence of original notation. It was mainly some students just wrote shorthand of words, but there isn't much in terms of originality. What language do they use when taking notes? So most students use both English and Japanese, yeah, and Japanese was used mostly for difficult words, concepts, and for spellings. And in the case of spelling, they use katakana. Do students who take notes in the L1 and L2 both get better test scores? So as I've talked about, all those students who use both English and Japanese got fractionally better scores in the 10-question multiple choice tests. There were no differences to those students who just use English in their notes. So why translanguage? Or why in note-taking? So spelling. So it's very, very convenient for students to quickly write down the Japanese equivalent rather than ponder and worry about, oh, how do I spell that word? Yeah. Speed. So they can, even in the writing in Japanese, rather than think about, oh, how do I spell that? They can write that much quicker in Japanese. L2 fatigue. Sometimes they're listening to English and they have to write down in English, and the longer the lecture is, perhaps it's more fatiguing for them. So maybe they might just naturally use Japanese. Yeah. And students use all their linguistic resources to help them negotiate meaning. So they can draw upon their Japanese knowledge, their English knowledge, and make notes based on a lecture which is solely in English. Also, individual personal choice. Only they will be looking at their notes, and if they can understand them, then it's fine. So translanguaging approach seems logical if the student deems it to be very effective. So results show that students prefer English over Japanese when taking notes or listen to academic content, and I've talked about the reasons. However, in practice, a slight majority of students use both English and Japanese, yeah, and this is especially evident with difficult words. And there's no evidence to suggest that writing notes just in English improves your test scores. So I think these findings show that most students use translanguaging in their notes to shuttle between languages and use the multilingual resources at their disposal to help them navigate their notes. Their goal, however, was to only use English, but this was not always possible, as I've showed you in their actual notes. So only using English note-taking did not lead to better test scores. So I think this can challenge the strict policies which we see in many schools, especially across Asia, where they say you should never use the L2. Only use English in English language classes. So I think even though that translanguaging is pretty much involved in bilingual education, EMI classes or CLIL classes, I think there is a space for it in EFL classes. Yeah, so I don't think teachers should be too strict on an English only policy. Yeah, so just like bilinguals, code switch, translanguaging is also a natural process where students can draw upon a variety of linguistic resources to navigate meaning and progress in that way. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening. I would love to hear your questions and comments, suggestions, so if you have any, please get in touch. Thank you very much.